With caffeine, it's an ergogenic aid, but it's only an ergogenic aid if we use it intelligently. Otherwise, it then is something that just drains capacity more than it fuels it.
If you're constantly tired, relying on caffeine to get you through the day, or taking tons of supplements but still not performing at your best, then this episode is for you.
I mean, the supplement industry is an absolute train wreck. You're thinking, I'm taking in 90 ingredients that are doing this for me, when in fact, you're probably only taking in about 5 or 6. But you're paying for the privilege of those other 70 odd ingredients that are in there that do nothing.
Welcome to the Optimising Human Performance Podcast. I'm Martin Jones, and today my guest is Phil Learney, a coach and educator who spent decades helping high performers improve their physical fitness, their recovery, and their long-term performance.
Sleep to me is the gold. If I can improve somebody's sleep, I am moving more biomarkers positively than probably anything else I could possibly do.
In this conversation, we unpack sleep, supplements, nervous system capacity, and why better performance often starts with self-awareness. Phil, welcome to the Optimising Human Performance Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Martin. But thank you so much for having us.
No worries. We've spoken before a number of times. I'm pumped to get into the weeds with this one because I know we share a lot of similar opinions.
Yeah.
Let's start by you cantering through your career. Can you give the audience a little bit about you? Who are you? What do you do? And how have you got to where you are?
Okay. I've been a coach for around about 30 years. Started as a trainer. Landed into an environment where it was, there wasn't much of it around where I grew up. I grew up in the Lake District, and I wanted to be a coach. I wanted to be what was at the time a personal trainer. I'd seen some people on the TV who were training celebrities and various other bits and pieces, and vocationally there was only a couple of things I was particularly good at, which was sport, and the other one was kind of art and design, and I kind of shied away from that. So I ended up doing sport. Went to university, did sport and exercise science, finished that, came back, got into fitness, personal training. And because of the nature of the area, there was no personal training at the time. This is a long time ago. And I just had to kind of pick a number out of the air as to what I was going to charge. So I went with what turned out to be quite a high fee. And by default then ended up working with predominantly high net worths for pretty much my entire career. And obviously they came with their own set of problems. So it was initially this thing of they wanted me to train them. It was all a physical thing. It was get me fitter, get me leaner, get me stronger, whatever it might be. And then all of a sudden other stuff started to stray into the conversation, which was, firstly nutrition. How do I eat? What are the things I should and shouldn't be eating? And often they kind of knew the answer. They just didn't know how to apply it. And then it got a little bit deeper into sleep. I had clients that traveled lots. They had hectic social schedules and various other bits and pieces. So my career as such sort of developed from that. And it was a service-based delivery. It was, they had problems and I had to solve them. And it ended up into more of a systems-based approach of looking at, what are the challenges they have on a day-to-day basis that influence their performance, be that sleep, be that social schedules, be that eating out, be that alcohol. And it was, can I find a solution or find ways to alter their perception of what they do alongside what they actually behaviorally do, which again took me down multiple rabbit holes. Spent a lot of time studying. I'm big on reading, studying. I think I've always been into that kind of academic side of things and the science of everything we do. And along the way, just kind of dug into it. And that then ended up with me working abroad for a short period of time. Did a little bit of stuff in elite sport. Worked then in London. And again, by default, ended up with very much high performers, high net worth clients, actors, actresses, sports people, largely from a recovery perspective. I work with one of the sort of more well-known physios in the country, and members of the royal family would turn up and have physio with him and various other bits and pieces. So he would refer a lot of people over to me because at the time there was very few trainers who were academically as qualified as probably I was at the time. And it was bridging that, what I now classify as kind of that subclinical space. So, personal training, you get qualified at a very low level. It's a very easy entry point. And there was this big academic bridge where we were always taught that we should be referring out and talking to GPs and working with this collective and larger industry. But ultimately there was the massive communication barrier, because these people were coming into it with a very low academic level and didn't really understand what that stage and that step was, moving up to what, again, on an academic framework is about a level 8 to 10. And you're trying to talk to these clinical practitioners about things and they just didn't understand them. So I think I got a lot of referrals from that, because he spoke in a language that I could understand and I spoke back at him in a language he could understand. So we worked really well together. And for me, that kind of developed the next part of my career, which was doing education. I saw this huge gap and felt that we weren't filling it very well. So I wrote 3 year-long courses, and I wrote one on nutrition, one on physical coaching, and one on business, because it was ultimately my thought process behind the business element was, look, a lot of people come into the industry, they love what they do, they're very passionate about what they do, they genuinely want to help people, but they leave the industry very quickly because they can't pay the bills. So for me, the business part of it was imperative to keeping good coaches in the industry. And at the time I watched as a lot of very, very good coaches just slowly moved into different industries because they just couldn't afford to live. So the business part was key for me. It was something that I learned on the hop, I guess, and had to develop. So I wrote 3 courses, business, nutrition, coaching. We had, over the course of around about 10 years now, we've had 6,000 coaches through it, who not quite as many qualified and finished it, because the year-long course is a lot to ask, but something I'm kind of very proud of to have assisted, I guess, with the development of the industry and to move people into that gap that existed, that subclinical space. Because remember, I think it's this thing where, if people have got sleep problems or issues around metabolic health and various other bits and pieces, a lot of people are just sitting there waiting for it to get bad enough so they can actually go and get to a clinical practitioner. And we've got this real big grey area in the middle that nobody's really dealing with. And I think that's when a lot of the prevention happens, and when a lot of the real legwork can happen, and we can do a lot for people before they reach that state. And I think when they reach that clinical state, often it's a matter of mitigating the problems rather than actually reversing everything and going back to where they were. So to me, that was a real huge part of that journey. And then about 4 years ago, I developed a supplement business. And a problem for me, it was, I was dealing with clients who were, they suffered from jet lag, predominantly social jet lag, which again, I'm sure you've discussed, I believe, on the podcast before. But they suffered with largely social jet lag, irregular sleep and wake times, which again caused huge amounts of disruption across, cardiovascular, metabolic, mental health, and it was stabilizing that. So I wanted to bring out a range of supplements that not only would support the biological rhythms, the circadian rhythms, and but also be able to help with shifting them. So we look at jet lag and how do we mitigate jet lag. And again, it's not about solving a problem, because physiologically we're never going to solve jet lag. It's we're not designed to handle that kind of travel over that duration of time. But what we can do is possibly mitigate the symptoms and the consequences of it, which is part of what I wanted to do. And part of that system was also encouraging people to do the right things at the right times during the course of a day. So it has an overarching element of tying other behaviours and habits into how you use the system itself. So I launched that, and then just in the last year I have launched the Future Wellness Group, which is an expansion, I guess, of the Advanced Coaching Academy, which was the nutrition, the business, and the coaching, because it was this broader space. Everybody got into this wellness space, and we started talking about wellness. But when we got into that wellness conversation, it was, again, those missing elements. I call them spokes because you put it into this form of a wheel. And the things we were really good at was physical activity. Coaches were pretty solid at that. Nutrition, We had some sleep practitioners. And obviously, when we get into these high performance environments, we typically have an individual allocated for each of those spokes. And they look after one element. This was a discussion I had with you, actually. Financial well-being was something that I'd omitted from this model at the early stages because it was something that I'd never really addressed and felt it was a little bit out of the remit of what we do as practitioners. And again, I had the discussion with you and several others, actually, and they said, look, financial well-being is a huge part of, somebody's ability to do something. And obviously, I'd encountered this in things like nutrition. Because obviously we've got to consider, financial status when we talk about nutrition, because there's huge problems there, and it was this thing, and it was this element that we brought in of talking about financial well-being, because it is a segment and it is a part of this overall human performance model. So what the Future Wellness Group was about was taking all of those spokes, and we developed a dozen spokes, and closing that clinical gap. Is coaching coaches up to a level where they understood that subclinical space, so we can help, but we also know when to refer out and also know when it steps outside of our remit, and just giving them practical starting levers. So for example, with sleep, how do we get someone to move on having a more consistent sleep and wake time? How do we identify when there's problems that go beyond that? How do we talk about, stress management, again, an area of specialism for you as well, around resilience. What does that mean? And how do we develop these skills or these modalities, and how do they all sing from the same song sheet, in essence? And I had a discussion with somebody yesterday, and they'd kind of set these rules out around nutrition. And my dispute was, and I went back to her and I said, look, are we talking exclusively about body composition here? Because one of the rules that she'd stated was meal timing doesn't matter. And I said, well, actually it does, but we've got to look at it as a larger picture if we're to understand why meal timing matters, because then we start to get into sleep, and then we start to get into the disruption of sleep, and then we then get into the disruption of metabolism and how our hormones react to that, and leptin and ghrelin and glucose metabolism and all of these things. And it was unifying and bringing all of that together. And obviously, you've worked in high performance, human performance for a long time. And it's that bringing together of all those modalities on a level that somebody understands them adequately enough to be able to, to verse them to clinical practitioners, or to be able to just assist in that subclinical space. So a large part of what I do now is, I do a lot of consultancy in that space, in that subclinical space. I do work with wellness brands, larger sort of hospitality brands. Hospitality is a really interesting space at the moment. And obviously my kind of area of passion is always elite level performance and sport. And
I thought you were going to say staying in 5-star hotels then.
Well,
Phil.
yeah.
that's a passion of yours too.
Yeah, yep. Well, I could say it's a passion. It's just something that my financial well-being probably doesn't always support. But yes, it's an interesting space, because you can see this entire shift of generations of people. Obviously, I talk a lot about, and in the world of science, we talk a lot about cohorts, right? And we've been in this big human experiment for centuries. And, we look at these generations and what they do. And again, in the fields that I know you work in, there's this generational thing of, look, it wasn't a study, but it was something we'd observed, and we've looked at something and we said, we haven't done this particularly well, and this is why. And we can learn from this. And it's what does that next generation do, and et cetera, et cetera. And obviously what we've got now is we've got this kind of generation that's coming through who are really concerned about self-care. They're really concerned about wellness, be it, it's a term that people don't entirely understand, and there's all these different interpretations. But this self-care piece, where people are actually concerned about their sleep, and they're concerned about their overall well-being, their relationships, we talk a lot about social wellness. Social wellness is just community. It's something that we need. We need other human beings, and we need to connect with them. And I feel that when we bring all of that together as a single entity, we're talking about human performance. And it was always this mirrored thing of, we talk about human performance in this elite sport, guys, and I've read countless kind of books on the old Soviet bloc and, recovery and restoration and all these things. And then you read them all and then realize that it's fundamentally all the same stuff. It's just a different vocabulary for a different population. And then it starts to all become quite relevant. And whether we're dealing with a corporate, whether we're dealing with the military, whether we're dealing with elite sport or whatever, a lot of those conversations are very much the same, because ultimately we're dealing with a human being at the end of it. So that's kind of where I got to, and this is where I am now. I spend a lot of time in that wellness space, I guess. To me, it's human performance. It's always been human performance. It's where my passion really lies, and yeah. So that was meant to be the short version, Martin. I apologize.
That was good. That was good. 20 minutes. That's a short version for someone as experienced as you, Phil. That is the short version for sure. Man, there's a lot to get into. We can deep dive into a lot of different spokes, I guess, and we can talk about you and your journey to where you are now. I think I'm listening to you talking, and there's lots of stuff going off in my head, because I think we share a very similar philosophy. I think this interdisciplinary, integrative, working with other people, getting the best of both, mashing them together to really understand the person at the end of it. You can have a really good meal plan, but if someone doesn't want to eat it, it's not a good meal plan. So there's a psychology component to that as well that you got to factor in. I'm wondering, as you look back at your career and you look back at the younger self as you came into the industry, was there anything that you see now as just being huge myths around performance that you now maybe signed up to them at the time, but you recognize, oh man, that was a terrible thing to do?
Oh, so many. And it was this thing that we see now, and I think probably more transparently than ever, is this thing, and we talked about it off camera actually just before we came on. It's this thing of, there was influence, right? And obviously influence now, because of social media, is a very different game to what it was when I grew up. When I first entered the industry, there was a couple of big names. There was the likes of Paul Check, there was Charles Poliquin, and there were these people that you sort of lent on and you trusted. And because they had this scientific background, or they came from a point of this huge wealth of knowledge, but it was this thing where they were very specialised at one particular spoke. And again, if we talk about the spokes, they were very specialised in one particular spoke. But what happened is their end consumer almost gave them liberty to talk about the other elements, but they just didn't have any knowledge in those elements. So what ultimately transpired is, because there was the commercial model to what they did, is they started teaching things they knew very little about. And it then became, the waters got muddied. And it was this thing of, because we had this inherent trust in these people, just like people do now, you go on the internet and you can listen to scientists and they're telling you absolute nonsense, but we inherently trust in these people because of their status and because of who they are. And obviously, when I grew up, it was the coaches. You went at the coaches, the people that were dealing with Olympic athletes, who were dealing with these elite populations. And with that, it was this thing of, anything they said, you just went with. And because they could logically put it into a sense that it makes sense, that it makes absolute sense. And the thing is, you can make sense of a lot of things, but it doesn't mean it's true. And it was this thing where there was so much trust put in these things. Like dietary systems were always a big one, Martin, as you know. It was this thing of, low carb, proteins and fats at breakfast. It was just this blanket thing of, this is the best thing to do for this. And then I couldn't really, I probably could if I dug into it and thought about it a lot. But there was so much where I got dragged down this garden path and I just genuinely just believed it. And that took me away from really what I'd learned when I went to university, was the whole thing about what, further education is, that you're meant to think critically. You're meant to think in this particular way. And that's what I went to university for, to learn to think in a critical way. And then years later, I stopped doing it. And I just trusted these people. And I think now I go at things with this hugely pessimistic view of, yeah, somebody said something, it sounds really convincing, it sounds, right, but I still need to dig into it just to make sure that what they're saying is correct, and this kind of ties into everything on a commercial level. Social media is riddled with stuff that's thoroughly convincing. Every day with my wife goes, "Oh, I read this," and the first thing I say is, "Where did you read it? I want to know where it came from." And we talk about this scientific hierarchy a lot, and I put that into the vast majority of my keynotes now. It doesn't matter who I'm speaking to. I talk about the scientific hierarchy, and it'll be phrased slightly different. Obviously, when we get to the bottom of the actual scientific hierarchy, it's, I start to put in there TikTok, Instagram, and all these different pieces, because then I'm like, look, this is where we're getting our information from. We don't know. And then we've also now starting to pull apart really some of that stuff that sits further up that pyramid as well, which again, I'm sure when we talk about, supplements and things like this, we can get into, because a lot of that is starting to fall down now. Because there's a lot of stuff that's been studied where we didn't really understand what we were studying, and it creates holes in a lot of stuff. So yeah, it's there was a lot, and there's a lot of stuff that I cringe at now, and I look at. But again, I'd like to think I'm the sort of person who doesn't mind putting their hand up and going, "Look, I was wrong. I was very wrong." But I'm very exploratory. I've asked you countless questions on LinkedIn and various, because I want to learn. I want to know more from people who know more about that particular subject than I do. And I'm far from an expert in any of these areas. There's people out there who know where, you've got a bookshelf behind you that I can see the vast majority of books there I've got, which I'm quite, stoked about. But it's am I listening to the right people? And then you've got to kind of eradicate that commercial side of things, because sometimes when there's commercial aspects involved, all of a sudden that story starts to get a little bit twisted. Yeah. So there was a lot.
Yeah, I reflect back on my own life and I started as a sports science student as well. Went to university, did sports science, and kind of think back at some of the stuff that I tried and did, and think, wow, the evidence moves on there, right? It felt right at the time, and it's only in hindsight can we look back and see these things for something different. I think what I think about is there's this idea of evidence-based practice, and there's what's called eminence-based practice. And I think that we are moving towards more of an eminence-based practice because of social media. It's this person is a professor, this person has worked with that athlete, so they're eminent in their field, and therefore I believe them. And there are holes in evidence-based practice, don't get me wrong. We've had Russell Foster came on this podcast in the first series, and he said the absence of evidence isn't the same thing as evidence of absence. If someone hasn't done the study, we just don't have the evidence. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, we just haven't done it yet. So I think there's having an open mind, but critical thinking, exactly what you just said. It's being able to just stop for a second and think, is there something else here? And I guess that leads me on to my next question. I think the fact you say it's not a supplement company, it made me smile, because nutrition to me, I'm not a nutritionist, as you know, as probably listeners know. I work with a lot of them. And I sometimes find nutrition to be a bit of a dark art, that, like you just said, protein at one time is great, and then another person will say, don't ever do that, it's protein at another time, or take this supplement at this much, and then someone else will say, never take that supplement. And you will get all these conflicts of these different nutritionists or dietitians who are competing against each other. And supplements is a you either have to take this or you never take that.
Sports nutrition's, in the grand scheme, relatively simple. Because we've got a handful of ingredients, probably not even a handful, to be honest, but we've got a handful of ingredients that we know work. They do what they're meant to do. They work very well in the areas that we would utilise them: caffeine, creatine, beta-alanine, arginine, or anything that nitrous sort of pocket, sodium bicarb, and positioned in the right place and used at the right time. Very, very simple. Do their job incredibly well. Then we get into kind of vitamins, minerals, we get into botanicals, we get into all of these other ingredients that we've used a lot of. And it's this thing that, we need to start asking bigger questions. What exactly is the ingredient? What part of the plant did it come from? If it's a botanical, how is it extracted? What's the dosage? Dosage is probably the key one. That's the first one. I think that's the first one we've always got to look at, and the one that I kind of go back on a lot. We've got these supplements out there, and I think you saw one of my posts the other day. There's supplements out there right now that, they pride themselves on the number of ingredients that are in it. It's almost, the more the better. And we've got these supplements, and particularly in the kind of green space, it seems to be the big trend in that space right now. And they've got.
I think I know what supplement you're talking about, because it's advertised everywhere.
It could be one of dozens, Martin. It could be one of dozens, genuinely, because they're all copying it. They're copying that original commercial blueprint, right? And that we've got 70, 80, 90 ingredients in something that you're taking a scoop that's in the grams. And there's certain ingredients in there that aren't they don't work at a human level until you're into grams of that single ingredient. And there's a lot of perception here, because you're getting this huge amount of ingredients. There's probably 80% of them are way below human dosage, so they're almost pointless. There's no reason for them to be in there. They're just there to make claims and make statements around mushrooms. When we look at the mushroom space is really interesting, because it's a very emerging space. We don't have huge amounts of human evidence. There's some really good looking stuff coming out, but again, we don't have a lot of human evidence. There's the fact that it's a plant. We've got to consider where on the plant it came from, and there's the mycelium, there's the fruiting body. There's all these different components of plants, and we forget about this. When you've got a botanical, and I always go back in Guy Ritchie movies. We've all seen a Guy Ritchie movie. What do they always leave when they steal the cannabis? They always leave the roots and the stem, and there's various other parts of the root as well, the rhizome, and there's various other elements. But the active compound is in the leaf, and this is true across anything that's grown, anything that's a plant, and it's in botanicals, mushrooms, same thing. So we've got, firstly, where on the plant did it come from? When in the year was it farmed? We talk about seasonal ingredients. We've then got the active compound, and then how did we extract that compound from the plant? If we use the wrong extraction method, so water tends to be, fairly safe. So we've got water-soluble compounds, we've got alcohol, which then tends to denature and damage, compounds within them. And then what we've now got is we've got a plant. We've got turmeric. People talk about turmeric, the yellow stuff you put on your food and it flavors food. But the active compound in turmeric is curcumin, and we need it at a certain ratio for it to have any kind of benefit whatsoever. And that ratio is quite high when we talk about human dosage and what we've seen to be effective with human dosage. So if it's the wrong part of the plant, if it's dosed incorrectly, and then we start compounding these things on top of each other, the chances of you getting something that actually does what it's meant to do is very few and far between. And the challenge we also have is that when a lot of those initial studies were done, they didn't determine where it came from on the plant. So it's a plant study. It's a study of ashwagandha, for example. It's not telling us whether it came from the leaf, the root, or the stem. It's just ashwagandha powder. It's a powdered plant. So now we've got a problem with the studies, because if it was never specified in the study, we don't know whether the study's actually, of any use to us. So we've got to kind of do this big reset in the world of supplements, not only on the level of what we're selling and what we're telling people they should be taking, but also on how we study these things. And if we go back on dosage is always the one, and go back on the greens powders, is that the dosages are so low that they're not going to do anything. And what they tend to do is they tend to use B vitamins at the right dose. Many of them use vitamin D. And all they do is they find the things that a lot of people are deficient in. So if I give the average person out there a bunch of B vitamins, they're probably going to feel a little energized and a little bit fresher and a little bit better. Give them some vitamin D, they're probably going to feel the same. So if I put them all in the dosage that we need them in, and there was a very famous multi-level marketing scam that's actually resurfaced. Do you remember the one where they would run the light through the skin for antioxidant levels? Are you familiar with this one?
Yeah.
Right, so this has resurfaced again. And again, they've renamed the business. And it's a multi-level marketing thing out of Utah, and where they all sort of originate. And what they do is they test. So it's this clinical thing, right? So I'm going to put this device on your arm and I'm going to measure something. Then I'm going to give you a bunch of supplements. You're going to take the supplements for 3 or 4 weeks. Then I'm going to measure it again, and it's going to have gone up. And it's a guarantee it'll go up, because they're giving you a bunch of vitamins that will move all those numbers up, specific to the measurement tool that they're using. But it doesn't mean that your health profile has improved dramatically. You've just absorbed these things in a slightly higher level than you were before. So we're then claiming it has all these health benefits. So when it goes back to the supplements, the key thing is firstly dosage, is that human dosage, we've got to look at all the studies, and we start to get into, when we can, the larger studies, the meta-analysis, the, you know, all of the larger pieces of data, and go, right, what are we looking at for human dosage? And obviously with human dosage, we've then got the nuance of, there's the average human being. Are we talking bigger, smaller? And we get this a lot with things like creatine, where, you know, people try and get smart and they measure their body fat and they're like, oh, well, I'm only going to take it in ratio to lean tissue. And I'm like, but all the studies were done on total body mass. You know, we're not that smart with respect to the studies, so therefore we're trying to outsmart the evidence, and it's just going to complicate the hell out of things. And and as you know, when we complicate things, people just don't do them. So we want to keep it simple, but ultimately it comes back to, firstly, we need human dosage. You know, we've then got to look at the forms, the types. You know, you look at like all the B vitamins. There's different types of B vitamins. You know, so we've got B12. Commercially, there's about 4 types that are typically used, and you know, there's 2 of them are probably highly effective. The ones that are most commonly used are the ones that are most ineffective. Magnesium, we've talked, I think, about magnesium before.
Yeah.
Huge amount of people deficient. So in the majority of cases, it's probably going to have a reasonable effect. The type of magnesium typically used is the cheapest form. You know, because again, these are commercial models that they're trying to sell, and it's magnesium oxide. But the absorption of magnesium oxide is pretty terrible. So therefore, we're taking in this ingredient in these, you know, huge amounts, but our body's only able to use a certain percentage of it. And what we're going at is we're going at the label. We're going, look, it says on the label that's in it, and it's at this dosage. Instead of going, right, hold on, what form is it? How much of this do we need? And you know, what type do we need? And is it, you know, and am I taking it with something else that conflicts with it? So it was this thing of, you know, the reason I don't like to call it a supplement is because of all of these reasons, but also the fact that it isn't something that you just take, and it never will be. A supplement is, by default, it's called a supplement for a reason. Something you take alongside other things. And what we wanted to do was create a series of products that you take at specific times, respective to your biological waking, so all from your first exposure to light in the morning. And we wanted to time it based off what our biology would do following that initial cue of light. So what we can do from that is we can start to break down, you know, how does the day look with respect to the afternoon slump? You know, we always use that term. The afternoon slump is a normal biological occurrence. It's a sequence of things that all happen at the same time, and it creates this kind of lull and this drop in physiological capacity. And what could we do at that point that could help people out with carrying on working and doing a little bit more? What else could we do to support the basics like hydration? What about getting out? So for us, we started that as a capsule. And the problem was people would forget to take it. Now, when people forget to take it, it's completely redundant. Doesn't matter whether it works or whether it doesn't. Nobody's going to take it. So we turned it into a drink. And what we needed to do when we turned it into a drink, we wanted to make it palatable. Because if we don't make it palatable, people won't do it. So there's all of these challenges on a commercial and a usage perspective, but we also wanted to compound it with this thing where, and I'm developing something at the moment, which is, it's kind of a club-based thing where it's this kind of afternoon club where we're trying to get people to bring together almost a community of people who use flow, but also do everything else as well. So they go out, they get some light, they get a hit of light to their optic nerve. They go out, they do a little bit of exercise. They go outside, they get some fresh air. And at the same time, they drink in flow, which is kind of the icing on the cake to me. It's not the foundations, it's the icing. And every ingredient we use in there is put in there for a reason. It's put at the right dosage. We spend a lot of time around extraction methods, type, where it came from on the plant. We do a lot of due diligence. Our suppliers hate us because we go to them with questions they've never been asked, which again is quite shocking because this is a company that's been manufacturing supplements for a decade or more. And we're asking questions they've never been asked before. And I'm like, well, hold on, that's a fairly basic requisite. You know, we want that particular type and form. And they go, well, we can get the other one much easier and it's much cheaper. I said, yeah, but that's not the purpose. I want the one that works. I want the one that's going to move the needle. And in some cases, we're not moving the needle very much, you know, because there's certain ingredients in there that if I was to pick my kind of top 10, Martin, and obviously this always comes back to the commercial thing, is that you kind of design this supplement from the top down. You go, right, what would the perfect dosage, perfect amount, blah, blah, blah. So go back on the greens powders. If I was to dose everything in the greens powder at the level that you should have it at, I would imagine it'd play havoc with your gut. but if we did, you're not taking a scoop of this thing anymore. You're taking a bowl full of it, to get the human dosage. Now, at that point, you then start questioning and going, well, out of these 80 ingredients, do I really need them all? And then you'd start questioning it. But because you've got this tiny little scoop that you just mix in a bit of water and you drink it, you're thinking, I'm taking in 90 ingredients that are doing this for me. When in fact, you're probably only taking in about 5 or 6, but you're paying for the privilege of those other 70 odd ingredients that are in there that do nothing, So for me, it was always, look, we've got to do things differently. If we're to set a bar, we've got to do things differently. We've wrote a white paper on Rise, which creates huge transparency. You tell everything. There's various bits that you don't put in there because nobody has a clue what you're actually talking about. But we put the evidence behind everything. We put in all the studies. There's some of them that, there's various ingredients that we will look to improve in the future, but we can't put in there right now because of the commercial side of it. That perfect product that you would create would cost an absolute fortune. So what you do is you break it down into, hold on, what are the biggest levers? And I always say this is the same as, the stuff that you do, the stuff that I do on a consultancy level, is that I am looking for the levers that will have the largest impact, and they're my first class levers, and supplements are never going to sit in first class levers. They're not, apart from probably on a clinical level when someone's sick, they might sit in that first class lever. And that's largely pharmaceutical medication. And it's a first class lever because it's necessity at that particular time. And we're looking at those first class levers. What are the things that are going to make the biggest impact across the board? And if we look at, for example, sleep to me is the gold. If I can improve somebody's sleep, I am moving more biomarkers positively than probably anything else I could possibly do, even devoid of exercise or anything else. So sleep is a big one. So the system that we created was all about supporting sleep and the sleep-wake cycle and encouraging people to do things in this routine, because cleaning your teeth, people remember to clean their teeth because you do it in the morning, you do it in the evening. You remember to take your vitamins because you take them in the morning or you take them in the evening. And there's things that we have, and as we know with habits have contextual cues. So for us, it was also about creating the contextual cue as well that sat with it, but also giving them something of huge benefit. And for us, it was about dosage and it was about sourcing those ingredients. And it was, we did due diligence beyond anything I've ever seen done before. And I'm sure there are companies out there also that sit with those kind of ethics and morals, but again, they're few and far between. I know a couple of sports nutrition brands that I would trust because of what they do behind the scenes, and I know they do it very well. But sports nutrition is a very different game to what we're playing in many respects. It's still human performance, but it's a different. We're looking at a window of performance where people are going, right, what do I take before, during, and after my performance? Whereas I would be looking at something, right, we've got somebody who needs to be on the ball 24 hours, 7 days a week. How do we ensure that? Improve their sleep. If we improve their sleep, the likelihood of that happening is way higher. Metabolically, they're going to be pretty sound. They're going to eat better. They're going to sleep better. They're going to have better relationships. They're going to be less emotionally volatile, which means their mental health improves. And that's just sleep. Amazing, right? So it was always about what are the biggest levers we can support and what are the biggest levers that will move the human performance needle. And for me, it was looking outside of that 1 hour or a couple of hours that people exercise a day, which to me is sports nutrition. And it was going, right, we're not just looking at vitamin support here. We're not looking at deficiencies. What we're looking at is how do we support these really important levers? And that's what it was. So.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. It feels like we're drawing back the curtain and seeing what's behind there. With the Wizard of Oz moment where we're seeing behind the screen. It makes perfect sense. And I think when you're describing it, the passion you've got about the work that you do, it comes out that there's things wrong with the industry, but people like you are trying to improve them. I think is what I'm getting from it. What about things like the personalization aspect? I just want to throw something across your desk and see what you think. So we were asked about caffeine. Caffeine is an ergogenic aid. It's good stuff. It does good things. It does bad things. But I was looking at trying to find evidence for a dose, like you're saying, dosage being really important. And there wasn't a doctor who would put their name to this, because there's so much nuance in how the genomics of caffeine, in terms of certain enzymes that are released at certain times or not, and certain things. And some people can handle a lot of caffeine, some people can't. Some people get habituated to caffeine and need even more, and some people get withdrawal symptoms. If you ever come across that kind of side of things, how do you deal with that, the variability in the person as well as the variability in the product?
There's the obvious stuff. And again, I had a discussion about this the other day where so firstly, I think we've got to understand that caffeine is something people get very passionate about, because it's something that is part of their day and has been for a long, long time, right? And then they will relate that to something that they consume the caffeine with, the delivery system, right? It might be, for the younger generations, it might be energy drinks, it might be a can of Monster or whatever it might be. And then we've got coffee, which again, people are very passionate about coffee, the creation, the occasion, everything that ties around it. And I'm always a big fan of, look, I never want to damage the occasion, because these occasions a lot of the time are sociable. And it's that understanding of, why do we have alcohol-free spirits? And again, I had somebody mentioned it on LinkedIn the other day, and I said, we really need to understand a little bit more about human psychology here, is that it's the option of being able to opt out of the caffeine or the ethanol. I want to be able to have the occasion. I want to be able to sit down with my friends, have a celebratory drink, but opt out of the alcohol. And it's the same with coffee, is that coffee now, because of, again, extraction methods, we went back on extraction methods before, the Swiss water technique, right? Not alcohol, we used to extract caffeine from coffee beans with chemicals, and it would make the coffee taste horrendous. It would taste like battery acid. But now what we've got is we've got an option. We can opt out of the caffeine, but keep the ritual, keep everything that's involved with it. So again, in a roundabout way, we've got to firstly understand that caffeine is something that people are very passionate about. So they'll defend it to the hilt, right? And the question that I got asked the other day, and I got tagged in something on social media multiple times, so I responded to it. And it was around the 60 to 90 minutes. I mean, I think we've discussed this as well. The 60 to 90 minute break from in a morning of not having caffeine.
Sure.
And we hear a couple of these scientific influencers, and they tie mechanisms around it, and they talk about the cortisol awakening response, and they talk about the afternoon slump and various other bits and pieces. And I think what happens there is that we lose track of really what we're talking about here. We're talking about somebody's basic ability in whatever the studies, and you could never study this, because what we'd have to do is we'd have to find a bunch of people who are literally so close to burnout that it would be ethically wrong. We wouldn't be able to do it. But with caffeine, because it's a central nervous system stimulant, ultimately we've got to look at the state of the central nervous system at the point of delivery. And that's going to reflect in dosage, it's going to reflect in volume, it's going to reflect in, and we've all had it, you'll have had it, I've had it, where odd days you'll have a coffee and you feel great. Other days you have a coffee and you feel like you've got anxiety running through your veins, and you're jittery and you're on edge, and it feels like your blood sugar's just dropped a country mile. And that's to do with this capacity. And I always talk about vessels. The human body is a vessel, it's a capacity. And when we talk about a lot of the things that we train and we do, and again, we've discussed things like ice baths, cold water immersion, heat, anything that taxes the body is looking at capacity. Again, military as a great example is, they're challenged on capacity. Push the body as far as you can and hope it doesn't break. And it's determining how big is that vessel. And often when we talk about this, and we discussed this not that long ago, and I talked about people's upbringing. I said, have you seen any correlation, because this is your field, not and correlation between how people were brought up, and did they have hardship when they were brought up, and does that influence that capacity and that ability to be resilient and hardiness and all those different terms that we use. And I find that element fascinating. But when it comes to caffeine, I think we've got to look at how is that capacity challenged on that particular day. And for me, it's this thing of, look, if you wake up in the morning and the first thing you do is smash a load of caffeine, and it makes you feel a little bit jittery, and it makes you feel a little on edge, it makes you feel a little wired, and you're a little bit short with your kids before they leave for school, wait 60 or 90 minutes, okay? Let your nervous system just calm down a little bit. let it do its little reset, and it does this in the morning. Let it do its little reset before you jack it right back up again. Because if you're at the ceiling when you wake up, which again, you might be able to note, because you wake up and the first thing that happens is your brain goes straight into work mode or whatever it might be, or you start stressing about finances or whatever it might be. If that's you, and when you consume caffeine, it exacerbates those symptoms, probably wait a minute. And then maybe consider your dosage as well. You know, and it might be a dosage, it might be a timing thing. And I think dosage and timing, and when, you know, and we mentioned this before, what makes a good coach? A good coach is someone who understands dosage. You know, whether we're talking about cognitive load, whether we're talking about physical load, we're talking about load management in all guises. In human performance, we're talking about load management. Is if you don't manage load well, you break. You know, whether we're talking about somebody on the trading floor, whether we're talking about, and remember, we found sticking plasters for all these things. And I recently used the you know, where he's lying and crawling out the Lamborghini in Wolf of Wall Street. Yeah. And I said, look, this is a prime example of capacity, and us creating this false capacity by utilizing drugs and stimulants and things that influence our nervous system, and they called them uppies and downies, and we've done this for centuries. You know, we've found ways to increase or temporarily increase capacity, but we also know when we increase capacity temporarily, we also challenge it long term. And again, with respect to caffeine, the dosage and the potency, I react very differently to caffeine if I was to have it in a supplement form versus coffee. And that's, again, to do with carrier mechanisms that come with the coffee bean and various other bits and pieces, the heat, there's other factors, there's all these delivery factors. But ultimately, it's this thing of weighing up, is today the right day for me to consume caffeine at this particular time? And whether we're talking about going in a sauna, whether we're talking about going in an ice bath or cold water, whether we're talking about going in the gym, it's being able to have that self-awareness of going, today is not the day, because I'm at capacity here. And one of the questions I always used to ask Martin when I was a coach, and I picked this up very early in my career, and I don't think I picked it up from anyone. It was just a thing that I felt was useful for me. And all I used to do is ask all of my clients, how has your day been? Just really simple. How has your day been? And then that would maybe expand into, how was your sleep last night? And all I'm doing, I'm gauging how hard I'm going to push them in the gym at that particular point. That's all it was. It was a capacity measure. It was a very, subjective capacity measure. It was just me asking a question and going, how are you feeling today? And as you know, you use a lot of surveys and things that people just fill out, and how do you feel, 1 out of 10, and we use these because it gives us a measure just in that moment to go, maybe not today. Maybe that's not right for you today. So I think when it comes to personalization, especially when we're looking at things like stimulants and depressants, it's got to be related to the individual at that particular point in time. It's got to be a snapshot. When we talk about dosage and we talk about things like vitamins and minerals and requisites and requirements, I think that's a different story, because we're not chemically altering a system that can have this cascade effect across the board. It does, but it's very mild. Whereas a stimulant is a different ballpark, because we're messing with something there that isn't really meant to be messed with that much. But if we use it really intelligently, we can actually, it's an ergogenic aid, but it's only an ergogenic aid if we use it intelligently. Otherwise, it then is something that just drains capacity more than it fuels it. We've used these sticking plasters, right? You often see the caffeine and alcohol pattern. People overuse caffeine during the course of a day. They mistime it. They use it, late on in the day, and then they need to use a depressant to calm the nervous system down, which is normally in the guise of a couple of glasses of wine. And now what we've got somebody who metabolically is a little bit messed up. They're also consuming a large amount of calories every night just before bed in the form of alcohol, and it just goes into this kind of continuous loop of poor habits that get reinforced by the state of your nervous system.
Yeah, I love that. It's a messy situation, isn't it? There's so much to think about. I think that, like you just said then, self-awareness, having a bit of an understanding of you, where you are, what you're doing, what's happening around you in your body, and making an educated decision, or making an informed decision. based on that information. It's having that informed decision-making process. One of the things, if we can just loop back a bit, it was interesting that you said, like, in your career, you went, physical training, all this, did all that good stuff, did a bit of nutrition, and then over time, it emerged that sleep was important. Like that appeared, and I've had a really similar story in that I said did sports science. I didn't do a single module in sleep when I did a sports science degree. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And it was only later in my career that I almost stumbled across sleep science as a pillar of performance, as a spoke of performance. And I just wondered, like, in your opinion, why does it get overlooked? Like, I sometimes go into the corporate setting, and it's like, oh, we're going to do a talk on sleep, and you see everyone's think, oh, here we go, this guy. And often at the end of it, it's like, wow, that was what the thing that I needed to hear. Like, why do you think this thing that we do every single day of our lives is largely overlooked in performance settings until people like you come in and show them how important it is?
I just think it's this thing it's been very difficult to give anybody numbers around it. We've never been able to measure it very well, and even to this day we don't measure it that well, but we can measure it. So we've got these markers. We've got, you look at the nervous system, we've got HRV now, and, stick that into coefficient variant, and now we've got a kind of an idea of what your nervous system is doing. And sleep was always this thing where we didn't know what to do about it, so nobody really talked about it. It was just an assumption that if you had bad sleep, you had bad sleep, you live with it. That was it. So there was nobody coming in with interventions, and often these interventions were very, there's nothing to support them. I always talk to people about baby books. If you had a baby, inevitably you've bought a baby book at some point. A baby book is circadian biology. That's all it is. They tell you to reinforce habits, do the same thing at the same time every day. And if you do, and I always talk about the bath situation. So it's like the bath thing is that it's historically in baby books, so they've kept it in there. But a bath is now a point at which kids typically they jack up the nervous system because it's a play area, and it's understanding the area. What's the area for? A bath used to be quite relaxing. You used to get in there and you'd relax and everything would be calm. But no, baths to kids now are play areas. And chucking a kid in a play area 30 minutes before bed probably isn't going to do much for their sleep. So there's all of these things that we couldn't measure anything. So we just attributed, and it was this thing of, well, if there's nothing I can do about it, and it goes back on what I said before, it was this, people were patiently waiting to get to a clinical problem before they were intervening. Oh, we've got insomnia. I can now go and see a GP. And what's the GP going to do? The GP might medicate, give some general advice, but the general advice is probably the same general advice they should have got 3 years before that. And it was this thing of having the ability and understanding where can other people help. And for me, a lot of this is, like what we're doing with the Future Wellness Academy, is that a lot of people don't really know what they're allowed to say and what they're not allowed to say. And with respect to sleep, a lot of sleep is just behaviours and habits. It's, wake up at the same time, go to bed at the same time every night, set a target. The amount of times I'll go into a corporate environment and I'll talk to them about targets. Corporate environment, everything they do is around targets, numbers, metrics, statistics. I do this at this particular point in the day. I said, what about your sleep? I said, do you have a set wake-up time? Well, Monday to Friday I do, because I have to get up and go to work. What about your bedtime? And I always go back in the Reed Hastings quote from Netflix, and his quote was, our biggest competitor is sleep. And then he said, and we're winning. And it's this thing of, you're talking to athletes, professional athletes who earn lots of money for performing, and they have very short careers, in the grand scheme of things, they have very short careers, so they all want to elongate their career. But when you start to talk about sleep, and you talk about, inflammatory markers, you start to talk about recovery, you talk about, injury risk goes through the roof if you're short on sleep. When we talk about short on sleep, we're talking 7 hours or less. People think 7 hours is brilliant, but 7 hours or less, we start to get into sleep deficiency, and then 6 starts to get even more detrimental, 5. And it always was this badge of honor. It was this thing of, and again, I talked at the very start of the podcast about cohorts. We look at the cohort from, again, let's use the Wolf of Wall Street because most people have seen it, right? It was this cohort of people who said, right, all I've got to do, I've just got to work long hours. I've got to perform cognitively. So what have I got that I can use as a tool to enable that and facilitate that? Right, I'll take that tool. what have I got that can help me sleep? Because I do need some sleep at some point, otherwise I'm going to have a breakdown. But we'll push it right to the limit. And that cohort, they worked on that principle. Sleep was cheating. It was this badge of honor of, oh, I only have 3 hours sleep every night, and that's me. And now what we know is, because we've dug into the studies and we understand, like, if you're getting 3 hours sleep a night, you're not going to last very long in the grand scheme of things. But there's always those people who go, yeah, but I've always been fine. But then define what fine is. You're smashing 2,000 milligrams of caffeine every day and possibly some other stuff. You go around the city in London on a Tuesday night and everybody's in pubs and bars with dilated pupils, and you're going, well, hold on, are you going to be able to sustain this? And it's, we've had these sticking plasters for a long time to be able to converge on these things and be able to cheat our systems. And now, because of what we understand, you look at alcohol and wearable tech, people who've got whoops or Uras or whatever it might be, and there's all these people just stopping drinking because all of a sudden they've got a number that just gets really messed up if you have a couple of drinks at night. And I think that's brilliant. And it's not, it's not superbly accurate, but it's good enough for somebody to go, oh my God, it has this. Hold on, did you never realize that every time you went out drinking, you were always tired all the rest of the week? And, it didn't matter whether you slept 12 hours, you still woke up tired. Did we never figure that bit out? And did we never put 2 and 2 together? And the irony is we didn't. We never did. We never looked back and went, oh my God, it's my sleep. When we look at energy, people say, about energy, and we've got nutritionists and various other people following these dietary systems where they're going, look, fast in the morning. And they're going, oh, well, by lunchtime, I'm really tired. I said, have you eaten anything? I'm like, you've got no energy in your system at all. You've got nothing available to you. And then you map it out and you realize they haven't eaten in 20 hours. And they're like, but fasting's good for me. Like, well, subjective, right?
Yeah.
And it is that self-awareness piece. And it's this thing of, look, and you always used to hear about hydration. People go, oh, well, we don't know the difference between am I thirsty or am I hungry? And it is kind of a self-awareness piece. But with sleep, I think it was this thing where we just didn't have a measure. It was just this thing of 8 hours sleep. You need 8 hours sleep a night. And then people would go, well, I only got 6 and I'm fine. I'm good. And we did this for years and years and years. I remember my parents doing it. And I did it. For a large part of my career, I was the person that people would ask, what's the best pre-workout out there? Because I was drinking them for fun. I wasn't just drinking them before a workout. I was drinking them to stay awake because I worked ridiculously long hours. Because that was what I was told what performance was. I was told that, true performance and succeeding in life is about, burning that proverbial candle at both ends and being able to sustain it. And I practically had a breakdown, and wanted to quit everything that I loved and was passionate about, and, relationships and everything basically broke. And then when everything broke, I went, hold on, maybe I just need a bit of a rain check here. And for me, it was that thing of going, look, I've got this wrong somewhere along the line. Because I was in the gym for 2 hours a day. My nutrition was nailed, but I'd binge. Because what I thought my nutrition was nailed, it wasn't. It was just creating this massive deficit all the time. And then I'd binge on a weekend, and then I'd validate that because people said cheat days or cheat meals, and I'd validate my behavioural stuff. But I was in this constant loop of 5 days on, 2 days off, 5 days on, 2 days off, 5. And ultimately, I was probably taking the same amount of calories as I would have been if I'd just eaten sensibly for 7 days a week and had a few bits and pieces here and there. So yeah, I think it was just a matter of, we couldn't measure it.
So now you're a bit older, Phil. You're a bit wiser. That's what you thought performance was. What's performance now? How do you? I don't know if quantify is the right word, but how do you recognize someone who's a high performer? If it's not that what you've just said, thrashing themselves to the point of destruction, what is performance?
I'm going to try and avoid saying these, coming out with the term balance. It's balance. It's balance, Martin. It's balance. It's,
You've done a terrible job avoiding the word balance, Phil.
No, look, it's not balance. To me, it's understanding that all these systems work together. And I think performance is, and the term that the kids use now is the flex, right? The flex once upon a time was, making loads of money. The flex then after that was partying lots, and then it changes generationally. And I think the big thing now is that you know, performance is a reflection of wellness, I guess. If we want to, you know, and again, we'd need to break down what wellness truly is. But when we look at wellness, it's the human's capacity to manage capacity across the board, psychological, physiological. You know, it's understanding dosage. Is that how much of this can I tolerate, and do I know when to step back? It's people who do have that ability to be able to, and again on a psychological level, which I know is a huge field for you, is this thing of, it's somebody's ability to be able to step away from what they were doing before. And I was, you know, when we talk about, you know, psychological well-being, it's this thing: can we down regulate to the point that we can take time off whatever we were thinking about before? And it could be music, it could be relaxing with family, it could be playing with the kids, it could be taking the dog out for a walk, it could be how do we switch from this is work Martin to this is other Martin, this is downtime Martin, this is chilling out Martin. And the problem is that we've had this culture of there is only ever this one constant 24 hours thinking about work, thinking about stress, thinking about physical output, thinking about, and it was this, we're spending all the time, but we're not saving, and we're not earning anything back, and we're not working on capacity. And I think working on capacity as a tool needs us to be able to switch off as well as we switch on. And I think human performance is reflective of that. And I go back on, you know, I talked before about the old Soviet texts on, you know, performance, and it was this thing of, you know, and it goes back to the Olympics, when the Olympics were like a political thing, and all the stuff they were doing, they were focusing on recovery, where everybody else was focusing on output. They were going, look, we just need more output, more output, more output. They were going, well, hold on, we need to just feed back into this and give them a bit of recovery. And obviously the stuff we're now seeing is all of this stuff that people were doing centuries ago. You know, we talk about downtime, we talk about time in nature, we talk about, you know, being present with your kids and being present with your family, and being able to switch off from social media. And I think we've got so much that taxes our physiology on a day-to-day basis, everything down to mobile phones, and, you know, our nervous system's being constantly on. How do we down-regulate and turn these things down? I think human performance is finding a balance between those two. And that balance would be, obviously, when I go back about training it, athletes were about, you know, you take them to the edge of that bell curve as close as you can to breaking them, then you bring them back, and then you take them back to the closest point to breaking, then you bring them back, and I think that is that constant juggling of, and that was human performance. And I think it's just the same in day-to-day life now. It's, you know, take people to the brink and make sure you bring them back, and with that they develop more capacity, they develop hardiness, you know, readiness, all these different things that everybody's desperate for. And I think they all develop concurrently, and physical output, and, you know, but understand what you need for your vocation. You know, you don't need to have the capacity of a military grade operator to be able to go into the city every day. And I think this is where you see that funny thing on social media where people are like, you know, they treat everything like they're going into war. And look, it's a deadlifter. It's what it is, right? You know, and as I'm now older, you know, I was a powerlifter for 10 years, and I just look and I go, when in life do I need to lift 300 kilos off the floor? And now to me, it's a trade-off. And I thoroughly enjoyed the process. I thoroughly enjoyed being that strong. But I now look back and I go, well, hold on. You know, if I carried on, which inevitably I could have, I would have probably just broken eventually, because it's not a matter of if, it's when in a sport like that. So it was, yeah, I think it's someone's ability to bring everything back. And I think human performance is, and as human performance practitioners, it's our job to push them as close to that edge as you can, and then bring them back. Mm-hmm. And that's our role as you know, human performance practitioners. But then on a day-to-day basis, I think it's giving people that self-awareness, that ability for self-care, that ability to be able to bring themselves back and use tools. And we give them tools. You know, breath work is something that I know that you've, you know, been digging into quite a bit. Is that breath work? It's there all the time. Something we can just dig into straight away. We don't need something in our pocket. We don't need tools. We don't need a device. We don't need a headband or it's just something we can just do, which again is, I think there's all of these things that are readily available to us, and even play. We were talking about some elite sports. Actually, I was at football, and what they'd done is they bought all the players Lego because they lose themselves in it, and they can switch off and just play. And we just don't do that anymore. That balance, it's been, and I hate the term in itself, but it's that ability to bring everything back to baseline, and sleep is about bringing things back to baseline. If you sleep well, you're flattening that curve, and then you can spike that curve again and go again.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Phil, I know you're a busy man, and I respect your time. So to start to wrap up, first and foremost, a massive thank you from me. I always enjoy our conversations offline, and to get this captured on the recording has been great. So thank you very much for coming on and sharing your pearls of wisdom. It's been awesome. If people want to learn more about you, they want to understand what you do, about your companies, what's the best way of people trying to find you or reaching out to you?
I think possibly an age thing, but LinkedIn is probably where you'll find me the most. I tend to spend less and less time on the other social platforms. I just find them difficult. LinkedIn is where you'll find me, just Phil Learney on LinkedIn. The Future Wellness Academy is futurewellness.education. So anybody who wants to explore that educational pathway that we have, we're in the first cohort. It's an 8 to 9 month course, so it's extensive. And, we take a limited number of practitioners at each cohort. We'll be moving into our second cohort in August of this year. And again, it's people who want to work in that subclinical space. So futurewellness.education. And then Human24 is just www. It's always a mouthful, that. Just hmn24.com. And that's, have a look at the journal, have a look at the further information we put on there. We put a lot of data on there. We put a lot of studies and various other bits and pieces on there. So have a read through all of that, and obviously take a look at the products themselves, but they sit into a system.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil. You probably know what's coming next. You've listened to this podcast before. To close up, I want to hand it back to you to wrap up for us. Something that you feel is particularly important. Maybe it's something you've not mentioned yet, or maybe you want to reinforce a key message. But just to close up the episode, again, I'll say thank you. Fantastic chat. Or, as I said, really, really valuable to me, and I'm sure it will be for lots of other people. But Phil, over to you. How do you want to close up for us?
Oh, wow. And I knew this was coming. I think it's just we've got to reflect back, I think, on what we've talked about. I think if anybody, any of the listeners are going to put any weight of effort into anything that they do, I think, you've got to address sleep as a whole. You've got to start to value it a little bit more. You've got to turn that Netflix off when they give you that teaser of that next episode and it looks all exciting and you want to get into it. And it's that thing of just set some targets and at least aim at them. The challenge you have is obviously a lot of these targets at different times we can't quite happily cop out of them and move into something else. But I think sleep is always going to be the big one. For me, it's been that big mantle for me. It's been the big change for me personally. But I think across the board, if I was to look at all the people I've dealt with throughout time, sleep has always been the big one. So I think it's got to be that one.
I couldn't agree more. Phil, that's awesome. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No worries. Catch you later.
A huge thank you to Phil for joining me on this week's episode of the Optimising Human Performance Podcast. For me, there are a few really important takeaways from this conversation. The first is that performance isn't just about switching on, it's also about your ability to switch off and to recover well enough to do it again tomorrow. Secondly, a lot of people are trying to optimize around the edges while ignoring the fundamentals. Sleep, recovery, stress management, consistency, and self-awareness are still the biggest levers for most of us. And finally, more isn't always better. More supplements, more caffeine, more output, more hustle. None of that matters if your nervous system is already running at capacity. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do for your performance is actually slowing down enough to recover properly. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please make sure to follow the podcast, share it with someone who'd find it useful, and we'll see you next time.